They called her forward. After days, some say weeks, of protests, chants, anger boiling in the streets, they demanded she speak. She stepped up, took the microphone, looked out at the same crowd that had insisted on hearing her voice, and then they shut her down, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it, because her words came in a different vernacular, because her tongue didn't match their expectation. Because in that moment, language became a weapon, and what unfolded next wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't just chaos. It was something far deeper, something far more dangerous. Because when people start rejecting each other based on language, it doesn't stop there. It spreads, it mutates, and eventually it turns inward. If you want to understand how something like this happens, and why it matters more than most people realize, make sure you like this video and subscribe to stay updated. Because what you're about to hear isn't just one incident, it's a warning.
Is the minister of intelligence in the country, but the minister and the president as well. Minister.
Structures to assist with the case. The intelligence structures, key crime intelligence, key state security. Which allows you to do business in that category.
This story matters right now because it exposes a shift that many societies ignore until it's too late. Xenophobia is often framed as hatred toward outsiders, foreigners, migrants, people from somewhere else. But what happens when that same mindset begins to fracture communities from within? When citizens begin to turn on each other, not because of nationality, but because of language, identity, and cultural expression. That's exactly what we're looking at here. At the center of this incident is a protest movement, a gathering of people united, at least on the surface, by a shared grievance. Reports indicate the protest was organized around social and political concerns, with participants demanding accountability, change, and representation. Tensions were already high. Crowds had gathered in large numbers. Emotions were raw. And in moments like these, unity is often fragile. The woman who took the microphone wasn't random. She had been called forward by the crowd itself, either as a representative, a speaker, or someone believed to have a voice worth hearing. But here's where things start to unravel. South Africa, like many African nations, is linguistically diverse. It has multiple official languages, each tied to distinct cultural identities. Language is not just communication, it's history, belonging, pride. But it can also become a dividing line. And in this case, it did. As she began to speak, it became clear that she was not using the language some members of the crowd expected. Within seconds, murmurs turned into boos. Boos turned into shouting. And shouting turned into outright rejection. She wasn't given time to explain. She wasn't given space to switch. She wasn't even given basic respect. She was drowned out, silenced, humiliated, all because of the language she used. But here's where things get disturbing. This wasn't an isolated outburst from a few individuals. It was a collective reaction. A crowd, once united in protest, fractured instantly over something as fundamental as language. And that raises a critical question. If a movement cannot tolerate linguistic diversity within itself, what exactly is it fighting for? To understand how we got here, we need to step back. South Africa has a long and complex history with identity, division, and belonging. From apartheid to post-democracy struggles, the country has grappled with questions of race, class, and nationality. In recent years, xenophobic tensions have periodically flared, often targeting immigrants from other African countries. These incidents have included violence, displacement, and economic exclusion. But what happened at this protest signals something different. A shift. Because this wasn't about foreigners. This was about language. About who belongs and who doesn't, based on how they speak. And that's a far more subtle but equally dangerous form of exclusion. Now let's walk through what happened, step by step. The protest begins. Crowds gather. Chants fill the air. There is a clear sense of purpose, even if the details vary depending on who you ask. Organizers or participants begin calling for someone to address the crowd. Whether due to leadership gaps or strategic decisions, a voice is needed to represent the moment. The woman is chosen or steps forward. She takes the microphone. There is anticipation. For a brief moment, everything aligns. But then she begins to speak. And almost immediately, reactions ripple through the crowd. Confusion at first. Then discomfort. Then rejection. Voices rise. Speak our language. Not that one. Stop. The atmosphere shifts from expectation to hostility in seconds. She tries to continue, but the noise overwhelms her. The microphone becomes useless. Her voice is no longer heard. What happened next raised serious questions, because instead of calming the situation, no one intervened effectively. No one stepped in to remind the crowd why they were there. No one reinforced the idea that any communication should be valued in a protest space. Instead, the moment was allowed to spiral. Eventually, she stepped back, silenced. And the protest continued. But something had changed. Unity had been broken. And the message had been sent loud and clear. You are only welcome here if you sound like us. This is the part few people are talking about. Language-based exclusion often flies under the radar. It doesn't look as violent as physical attacks. It doesn't always make headlines like riots or clashes. But it plants seeds. Seeds of division. Seeds of mistrust. Seeds that can grow into something much bigger. Because today it's about language. Tomorrow it could be about accent. Then tribe. Then region. Then ideology. And before long, the lines become impossible to ignore. Now consider the contradictions. A protest, presumably about justice, fairness, or representation, rejects someone for expressing themselves differently. A movement that demands to be heard refuses to listen. A crowd that calls for unity enforces exclusion. How does that happen? Is it fear? Is it insecurity? Or is it something deeper, something embedded in the way identity is constructed and defended? Another critical question emerges. Was this really about language or about control? Because language can become a gatekeeping tool, a way to define who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to belong. And when a crowd collectively enforces that gatekeeping, it reveals underlying tensions that go far beyond the surface. Now, let's talk about impact. Socially, incidents like this erode trust within communities. People begin to question whether they truly belong, even in spaces that claim to represent them. It discourages participation. It silences voices before they even try to speak. And it reinforces the idea that difference is something to be rejected, not embraced. Politically, it weakens movements. Because division within a protest undermines its credibility. If a group cannot unify internally, how can it demand unity externally? Leaders lose legitimacy. Messages become diluted. And the cause itself begins to fracture. Economically, the implications are more subtle, but still significant. In diverse societies, cooperation across linguistic and cultural lines is essential for growth. When divisions deepen, collaboration suffers. Workplaces become tense. Opportunities shrink, and inequality widens. But perhaps the most concerning impact is psychological, because moments like this send a message, not just to the person who is silenced, but to everyone watching. Speak carefully, conform, or risk being rejected. And that kind of pressure changes behavior. It shapes identity. It limits expression. Now, let's look at public reaction. On social media, the incident has sparked intense debate. Some people condemned the crowd outright, calling the behavior shameful, embarrassing, and dangerous. They argue that this is exactly how xenophobia evolves, starting with outsiders, then turning inward. Others, however, defended the crowd. They claimed that communication in a shared language is necessary for unity, that in high-stakes situations like protests, clarity matters. But here's the problem with that argument. Clarity doesn't require exclusion. Understanding doesn't require humiliation. And unity doesn't require uniformity. There are also voices trying to take a middle ground, acknowledging the importance of language while criticizing the way the situation was handled. But even those perspectives raise uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't there a system in place for translation? Why wasn't there a protocol for multilingual communication? Why did it escalate so quickly? And why did no one stop it? Media coverage has been mixed. Some outlets have highlighted the incident as a symptom of deeper societal fractures. Others have downplayed it, treating it as a minor disruption rather than a significant warning sign. But ignoring moments like this doesn't make them disappear. It allows them to repeat, and potentially to escalate. So what happens next? At this stage, there are no confirmed legal actions tied directly to the incident. No official investigations into the behavior of the crowd. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences. Community leaders may be forced to address the issue, especially if public pressure continues to grow. Activist groups could push for more inclusive practices within protest movements. There may be calls for education around linguistic diversity and tolerance. But whether any of that actually happens depends on how seriously people take this moment. Because it's easy to dismiss it as just one incident. It's harder to recognize it as a pattern in the making. And that brings us to the final question. Where does this lead? Because history shows that division rarely stays contained. It spreads. It deepens. And it often returns in forms people didn't expect. Today, it's a woman being silenced for her language. Tomorrow, it could be anyone. So the real issue isn't just what happened on that day. It's what it reveals about the direction things are heading. And whether anyone is willing to change course. Because if a society begins to reject its own people over how they speak, then the problem is no longer about outsiders. It's about who we are becoming. And that's something far more difficult to confront. Now I want to hear from you. Was this truly a case of xenophobia, or something else? Should language ever determine who gets to speak in a protest? And what does this say about unity in diverse societies? Drop your thoughts in the comments.